Again, I was scared to die. But hell can't be worse than this. My daddy's back.
Right.
Like, daddy's gonna protect me.
Yeah.
That was not the case.
Amanda Pulley, a leading advocate for fighting human trafficking.
Co-founded Pulley Consulting, dedicated to supporting organizations in effectively combating human trafficking and providing comprehensive support to victim survivors.
She transforms adversity into action. As a prior victim of the IBLP cult, Amanda is a survivor of human trafficking.
The story's bad up till this point. This part of the story is very difficult for a lot of people to hear. Once they were finally done, they told me to go take a shower to get rid of all the blood. And he beat the ever-living shit out of me until...
Oh my God.
Devastating. Like, there is no word to describe the depths of despair.
Welcome to Unbroken From the Ashes. I'm James Ash.
And I'm Jessica Ash.
And today we have our first ever guest, Amanda Pulley.
Yay! Yay! I'm so glad to be here with you guys.
Happy to have you guys here, or have you here.
Hey, ain't
Well,
I always
and you
here?
too.
Right? She's here too.
So Amanda is a survivor of human trafficking and has some amazing stories on how she got from being in a very broken place to really being an amazing advocate and warrior for human trafficking survivors. So Jess, why don't you launch us off here?
Well, we have to do a little bit, housekeeping first. First of all, we're still in Arkansas. If you're watching the video, there's a baby sock hanging off of his chest. It's his central line that it really starts to irritate his skin. So he actually got a baby sock and put those little pieces of plastic in that and a hair tie to hold it on.
That's creative.
I saw it on one of our support groups. The guy, he kept tucking it under his shirt, and the plastic caps kept rubbing on his skin. So I was like, you know what? That's a good move.
Yeah, absolutely.
So baby socks are really expensive now. That's what
They
I learned.
are.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
So we actually met Amanda when we went to a local jiu-jitsu gym that is run by James's buddy Ryan. And so we went there, and James had the opportunity to do a mindset minute. And while we were there, we had the good fortune of meeting Amanda and her husband, and they spoke to us straight to the heart. That made us both cry because they seemed to see right into our souls and what we were experiencing. And as a result of that, we spent a bit of time hanging out with them after, and that's where we learned just how amazing this, Amanda's story is. And so we did ask her to come as our first guest on the podcast. So Amanda, I'd like to walk through kind of like what it was like for you growing up and kind of go through that process, if that's okay. And then, what happened going into adulthood, what were some of those experiences, and ultimately how you were able to transcend a lot of what you've been through. And what are you doing now? And how does jiu-jitsu fit into this?
Yeah, that's the fun part, right? How does jiu-jitsu fit in? I had a very confusing life growing up, to put it very mildly. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. So when I heard y'all were from Pittsburgh, I was like, wait a second. But I grew up in the Lancaster area. And it was a home setting where we were really poor. My grandparents were highly involved in a church there. And so it was a very religious setting my whole life. And I grew up being told certain things at church that my family didn't match up with. And it was super confusing as a kid. So for instance, very much abstinence mindset across the board. And yet my uncle, who was on drugs, lived in our basement. And there were times like I would help him escape the police and hide him in the woods in my fort. And he would tell me how to bring his drugs to him so I wouldn't, get contaminated by the drugs, right?
Wow.
And so, I mean, I was like 6, 7 years old, sneaking drugs out to my uncle who's hiding out in the woods. And that was so different than what I was hearing at church.
Sure.
At church, it was you got to read your Bible every day and you got to pray and you got to be this perfect little Christian girl. Otherwise, God's not going to love you and you can't go to heaven. And I was confused always by, well, wait a second. We're being told all of this at church, but at home, it's so different. And yet there was no way to say, but this is what's happening in my home because my grandparents were upstanding members of the community.
Right.
And they were respected. So there was no outlet to really talk about or even ask questions. I grew up being taught that men were not only just the leaders of the home, but they are in charge of every aspect of your life. If a man said jump, you didn't even ask how high, you started jumping and then ask if it was good enough. And so I just, from the time I was a little girl, anytime a guy told me to do anything, it was, okay, yes, sir, I will, and I would start doing that thing. And that really led me into some situations that I don't think I would have been in without that training.
Certainly.
Right. That makes sense.
When I was young, probably around first grade, my great uncle moved into our house. So our house had this open door policy. Anybody was welcome at our house. Like literally my grandparents never locked the doors.
Wow.
I didn't even know that was a thing until I got married. And my husband was like, well, you should lock the door behind you. Like even yesterday I went to the grocery store and he's like, did you lock the door? I'm like, oh yeah, I should do that before we leave. So it was just something we never did growing up. And because of this open door policy, I'd come home from school and my questions were always, who's here? How long are they staying? And do I get to sleep in my bed tonight or am I sleeping in the crawl space?
Oh, so sometimes they would displace you from your bedroom.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because that's what we're supposed to do. And especially as women, we're supposed to serve other people. And so that means giving of ourselves, giving of our bed, our clothing, whatever somebody else needed.
Okay.
And so, I came home from school one day, my grandfather's sister and her husband were at our house. So technically my great aunt and uncle, and they just moved in and they were there for a few months and
Wow.
I built relationship with them and I thought they were good people because my grandparents loved them. When they moved out, they continued inviting me to their house and, I would go and things were normal for a while. But my mom had throughout the course of all of this gotten remarried and her ex-husband was extremely violent. And so we would see her being abused and we would get sent to my grandparents' house because she was in such an abusive relationship. And one day I saw my grandma get a call and my grandpa grabbed his gun. He was like an NRA enthusiast. Like that's what we did on the weekends, just go shoot guns.
Right.
And so I always joke because he died literally with like 4 guns around him. Like one was tied to his ankle, one around his waist. I mean, he had 2 laying next to him. Like that's the way he was going out.
Right.
Was, he didn't use them, but he was going to have them by his side. And so they all of a sudden run out the door and my grandpa turns around and he goes, lock the door and don't answer for anybody. Well, we didn't lock the door in our house. So I knew something was wrong, like really wrong. But I saw him grab his gun and I was scared that I was going to lose my grandpa.
Right.
Like he's going to go to jail for something. I have no idea what's going on. So I called my great aunt and uncle and I said, would you please come to the house? They came to the house and my great uncle was like, hey, how about you and I go in the backyard? And we went in the backyard and sat on the swing. We were in the country. We were not in the city. And so there were trees around. It's not like anybody could see us where we were. And that was the first time he raped me.
Wow.
was there on the swing, me waiting to hear, is my mom dead or alive? What has happened to her? And that started events of me being raped and molested pretty much through 8th grade
Wow.
on a very consistent basis. And so what he would say to me was, hey, you don't have a dad in your life. And so I'm going to be your dad, and I'm going to do to you what daddies do to their little girls. And so that desire, because my parents were divorced, I was the only kid that I knew with divorced parents, that desire for a dad,
Sure.
and the fact that he was a man saying that, like, you're going to do what I tell you to do. And then on top of it, as I got older, he started threatening to do it to my little sister. And I was going to protect her with everything in me.
Right.
Right. So you add all those components on top of each other, and I had no idea it wasn't even normal. I had no idea that it wasn't okay. And I just went along with it thinking it was normal to have to earn everything. So he would take me go-kart riding. I've always had like an adventurous spirit, wanted to do the dangerous stuff.
Sure.
And so we would go go-kart riding, but I had to pay for it by giving him a sexual service.
Right.
You know, and I learned even as a very young girl that everything came with a cost and that I didn't deserve anything. The only reason I believed in my core that the only reason I was alive was to pleasure men sexually.
And so that was elementary school, essentially.
Yeah, I was probably 7 years old when all of that started.
And did you feel like this was your fault, or did you that you didn't even have like you didn't sense fault? It was just the way it was.
It was the way it was. I mean, when you have sexual abuse happen that early, there is no boundary box. You know, most people would, if they've been abused later on, they have some semblance of that's not okay, that's not right. And even in the work that I do now, when I teach in the schools, I'm really conscientious of that, and we'll talk to them about what is appropriate touch. Because if they've been abused from a very young child, they don't know the difference. They don't know that it's not okay for someone to touch them that way. And, you know, I spent most of my life thinking it was normal. In fact, the only way it finally came out was I was at a birthday party that was a sleepover with some friends, and they were playing kind of almost like a spin the bottle or, you know, type game.
Sure.
And during this game, one of them said something about, have any of you ever seen a boy part? We didn't even know, we weren't taught the names of body parts. Like, it was a sin to say the names of the opposite gender's body parts. And so they asked, and I very hesitantly was like, well, yeah, haven't you? Don't your daddies show them to you?
Oh, wow.
And my friend went home and told her mom, who was one of the first state troopers in Pennsylvania as a female. And she was like, wait a second, what just happened?
Right.
So again, the course of all of this, it shows the odd spiritual dynamics that I grew up in, because even her as a state trooper, she didn't call the police right away. She called the pastor. The pastor brings me in and asked me what's going on. And I thought I was going to hell. Like, it was over. I was done. And so he calls me into his office. He asked me, is this true? And I very hesitantly go, yeah. And then I was concerned he was going to tell my grandpa, because he said, you know, he's the leader of your home. We have to tell your grandpa. And all I had was this image of my grandpa grabbing a gun. And now I was going to be the reason that my grandpa was in prison. And I was terrified. So finally, after recounting stories to my pastor, he called the police, and that started this whole case being opened, which honestly ended up being more traumatic than helpful. I'm not anti-reporting to the police by any means, but the way the investigation went years ago was not helpful. Law enforcement called me in. I don't remember during any time being told that it wasn't my fault, that it wasn't normal. I'm going through this whole process thinking I'm going to hell because now I have to say words that I'm not even supposed to know. I just am supposed to say that's a boy part,
Right.
and they had me call my uncle, and they were writing notes to me trying to get him to confess to it on the phone.
Wow. Using you as bait
Yes.
to get his confession.
Yeah, in like 7th grade.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And from their perspective, I would imagine that they had no idea you didn't know that this was wrong,
Absolutely not.
right? So there's so much education that would need to be, that it's like a big gap, right?
Absolutely.
Because how would they know that this young girl in front of them, that it came out somehow? So they probably assumed you knew it was bad and you were reaching out for help. I'm speculating, but I can see a big gap there that,
Right.
could use some education.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so around that time of me reporting, about a year earlier than that, a man started coming to our church who ended up being a deacon there. He brought in IBLP, Amazon documentary, Shining Happy People. It's basically like this underground cult that came into a lot of really good churches and had very toxic teachings, especially towards women. And Gothard is the leader of IBLP. He very much just taught men are respected. And if a man says he's converted, like all of his crimes, all of his sin is swept under the rug. He is now in the group and we don't even talk about it. If you wink at a boy, it's going to lead to holding his hand, and holding his hand is going to lead to dancing with him, and dancing is going to lead to sex, which means I'm not going to heaven. Getting married was the best thing that could happen to a woman. Getting married and having children. They did not believe in victimization. If you didn't cry out to God for help in the middle of your rape, that you chose it.
Wow.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Well, I didn't even know to cry out.
Right.
Like I didn't know it was wrong.
Right.
Right.
You
know-
didn't know it was rape.
Right. And, I'm in junior high or just getting into junior high at that time. And so purity culture was a big thing. And so we were just told you don't have sex until you get married. And here I am going, but I've already done that. Like I'm identifying what happened to me as sex. There was no framework for abuse, rape, anything.
Right.
And so this teaching starts coming in. And my religious upbringing is just getting harder and harder to deal with.
Right.
We already had very strict dress standards. I wasn't allowed to use like red nail polish because that's what prostitutes used. We weren't allowed to have like colored underclothing, like bras, underwear, anything like that because, well, why would you need that?
Right.
And like, I go to the store and be like, but it's cute.
Right.
And they'd
Yeah.
be like, you can't have that. Who's looking at it?
Right.
And I'm like, okay. So those pieces were getting even more strict. And I think what's confusing and what a lot of people don't realize is even in the anti-trafficking movement, we often look for people who, well, they're dressed differently than the weather. Right? So she doesn't have enough clothes on and it's cold outside. Maybe she's a trafficking victim. Well, if you would have looked at me, you would have thought my rebellious move that my trafficker required was to dress more normal.
Right.
It was not to dress provocatively
Right.
in any way, shape, or form. And so those pieces, because of what was happening in the church, it made it harder to spot. So about the same time I was in court with my uncle, I had to testify against him. I said the word penis the first time out loud in front of a judge with my pastor looking at me thinking I was going to die and go to hell. The next Sunday I go to church and he preaches a sermon on if your hand offends you, you should cut it off. And I'm sitting there looking at my hands going, somebody should cut my hands off. And I had no idea that that's not what that verse means.
Right.
Right. And I'm sitting there, I'm heartbroken and ashamed. And I had the start of a really severe eating disorder. I had nobody to talk to about any of this. All I thought was, if I read my Bible and pray enough, maybe God will let me into heaven, and maybe I can be forgiven for this sin that I committed.
Which at this point, you are blaming yourself.
Absolutely, 100%. And so this guy started coming to our church. He was my friend's brother. And this girl was someone I looked up to as like the cool girl. I was very introverted. People don't believe me that I'm actually an introvert, but I can do like hard conversations. I can do small groups. You put me in a large group and I'm like, can I run away now?
I hear you.
But she was always bubbly and full of life and just having fun, and the boys liked her. And so when this guy started coming to church with her, I didn't know who he was, and eventually it came out it was her brother. And I was singing in choir, and all of a sudden he would like wink at me. And I was like, oh, like he winked at me. Like maybe I am pretty to someone.
Sure.
You know, my self-esteem was in the tank after all the abuse.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, maybe he thinks I'm cute. I don't know. But then I was ashamed because, well, we're not allowed to wink at boys. If you wink at a boy, it's going to lead to holding his hand, and holding his hand is going to lead to dancing with him, and dancing is going to lead to sex, which means I'm not going to heaven. Like this whole pattern is just on repeat in my mind and my life. And so I kind of ask her, like, who is that? She's like, oh, that's my brother. He got out of prison not too long ago. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, a few weeks later, he is put as not a youth pastor, but like a youth leader in our church over the teens. And he starts working with the youth group because he had this great conversion that happened in prison, and his whole life has changed.
So well, I'm sorry. So how does that happen? How does, I don't know, a responsible leadership who see potential in somebody who had this, did you call it a conversion?
That's what they called it. Yeah.
In charge of teenagers, like I can't even comprehend that type of decision making. I mean, let them be in charge of the garden.
Right.
Right.
Right. I've been asking that for years. I'm like, what was going through their minds?
Yeah.
But in there, I think really a lot of IBLP's teaching came in, and Gothard is the leader of IBLP. He very much just taught men are respected. And if a man says he's converted, like all of his crimes, all of his sin is swept under the rug. He is now in the group, and we don't even talk about it.
Wow.
So it wasn't even publicly announced that he had been in prison. Like I only found that out because I was friends with his sister.
Right.
And it wasn't until much further in the story, but I always pointed out early just because I think it's pertinent to know.
Yeah.
You know, just because somebody says they're converted doesn't mean we should just be, okay, here's our kids. Go have, do whatever.
Sure.
We trust you.
Sure, exactly. And you're setting the stage that it's so easy from the outside, in retrospect, to see like all the potential vulnerabilities that were created for groups of girls or individual girls. Like it was the perfect setup for that. And not that every girl would have been victimized, but
Right.
you can see how there's no redundancy to prevent something from happening should it happen.
Yeah.
And I can see that stage being set pretty
Absolutely.
clearly. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, he's coming on the scene right after having been in court, my uncle being convicted of his crimes, and my family split in half because of that. So half of them sided with my uncle, half sided with me.
Wow.
And so, I'm the problem, right? Like in my mind, I am completely the problem.
Right.
And so he comes in and he goes to my mom, who's a single mom. We all live with my grandparents at this point. She had finally divorced her second husband, who was very abusive. And he goes to her and says, well, Amanda's kind of awkward around guys. Duh.
Well, no kidding.
Duh.
Right.
Yeah.
And so she's awkward around guys. I would like to be her big brother and take her under my wing. And my mom goes, awesome.
Oh, okay.
And, that really, I've learned over time to have forgiveness and love for my mom. In full transparency, we don't have a relationship, and that's been her choice. But I can forgive the fact that she was so broken that she didn't find her unbrokenness yet. She didn't come out of it yet. And so in her mind, she was helping me
Right.
by making me not be awkward around the guys.
Right.
Because in the world that we grew up in, getting married was the best thing that could happen to a woman. Getting married and having children.
Right.
And I have all kinds of funny stories about that. We had this one group come to our church, and this guy literally offered my grandpa 3 goats, 6 chicken, and a cow if he would let him marry me.
I had an experience with that in Iraq. Where we went to an outpost, and someone offered me 3 sheep for my female gunner.
Oh my goodness.
Come on now.
Right? No, this was in America.
Yeah,
Let's be really
exactly.
clear. In America.
That's what's blowing my mind, though.
Exactly.
Is that this happened here?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. They were like, well. And my grandpa thankfully looked at him and said, yeah, that's not enough, and walked away. But I still, my mind is still blown thinking about that.
It's unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of my friends were in prearranged marriages from 12 years old.
Wow.
And some of the guys were, way older than them. Sometimes they weren't, which kind of comes into play into this story a little bit, that there was another girl who was much younger than I was. So this guy we're talking about, he was 28 years old, and I was 16. Well, I had a friend who was 12 years old, and she was betrothed to him.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that was like a prearranged marriage, like a promise, like an engagement.
Yeah, definitely. And so again, in my mind, I'm going red flag, red flag, red flag. They were all blew past, and the church just kept trusting him. And for the first few weeks of him being my big brother, things were fine. He would take me shopping. He would take me out to eat. My family didn't go out to eat all that often because we were poor. We got our clothes from this Amish Goodwill type store, and on Saturday they had fill a bag for $1 a day. So we would go and fill our bag and stuff stuff down in there so that way we could get the most bang for our dollar.
Right. Yeah.
And he would take me to, get this, he took me to Old Navy.
Old Navy.
Wow.
And I could buy something off the rack.
I completely understand what that's like.
Yeah.
The first time I went to a restaurant, I was like, I'm rich. I went to Denny's.
I know the feeling.
But it was my first restaurant, and I was 10.
Yeah.
But I was like, I'm rich now.
Right. It's not that every once in a while we were allowed to get something off the dollar menu, but we knew if we were doing that, that was all we had to eat. So we never had the French fries because you knew you'd be hungry later.
Right.
But that was all you got for the day. It was, this is all we have.
Yeah.
And so he would take me to get a whole, he bought a whole pizza, and I could eat as much as I wanted.
Right.
Now, granted, I had an eating disorder, so that was very little at that time, but I still had the option.
Sure.
So he was seeing your vulnerabilities and your needs, and very deliberately meeting those.
Yes.
And grooming you to essentially open your heart to him.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, even with the eating disorder, he would tell me, no, today you need to eat 2 pieces. Well, and I would start having a panic attack because, but that's the only thing I can control in my life. It was my way of coping. And I was like, I can't eat 2 pieces. And so I would run I was a runner pretty much most of my life, and I would run like 10 miles a day while having a very severe eating disorder. It is not suggested, not healthy at all, but that's how I coped. And so he would make me eat too. So I would go 15 miles that day.
Wow. Yeah.
So early on, even during his early grooming, the control was eking in.
It was.
Like now he's controlling your one way of controlling your environment. Well, maybe two, running and eating. Now he's starting to dominate that.
Yes. And even taking me to Old Navy, the first time I got to pick whatever I wanted. The second time, it was, no, you're going to wear that. And he knew what strict standards we had. So get this, I had to buy something that showed my collarbone. Because, I was going to go to hell for that one. And it was those slow patterns of control.
Right.
He bought me a cell phone because, yes, I am old enough that cell phones were not common, and he bought me my first cell phone and put minutes on it because we had to pay per the minute for all the young people listening.
And that was local. You didn't have,
Right.
You had to pay for roaming.
Yes, exactly. And so he bought that not to be nice, but because I had to check in with him
Yes.
at certain times every day. And he controlled so many different pieces of my life that nobody had any idea that this control was getting worse and worse. And I mean, our first kiss, he set up like this beautiful moment. It took me to a lookout place that all the teens were going to, and I didn't know what a lookout was. I was this like good little Christian girl that had no idea what that was.
Right.
And he set up the scenario to be again where my brain and my body, due to all the trauma, immediately went back to, oh, I know what this is. And then he said, I'm the youth leader at your church. I work with the youth group. I love you and I want to marry you. And just like Ruth had Boaz to be her kinsman redeemer, I want to be yours. And that means you can't get into heaven without me, right? So you need someone to take all the things you've been through and fix them so that you can be holy before God to get into heaven. And I'm going to be that person for you, but you can't tell anybody we're dating. You can see how they might not understand, right? I'm betrothed to this other girl, but I'm really in love with you.
Wow, on so many levels. So he's luring you with these things that he knows you would be susceptible to. Then he uses them on subsequent times to make you make a decision that's in conflict with what you need to get the shirt that shows your collarbone, and that's in conflict with what you believe.
Exactly.
But you have to, because he's telling you to. And if you don't, then that's in conflict with what you believe.
Yes.
So he's grooming you to not stay true to what you may actually believe is the right thing.
Right.
And then he's also putting you in a position where essentially the only way you get into heaven is through him.
Yeah.
But you can't get into heaven through him because he's betrothed to somebody. So you're in a no-win situation. So what do?
Absolutely. And over time, it moves from just the verbal manipulation and coercion to, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to beat you. And then the beating started being, well, I'm going to beat your sister.
Yeah.
Your sister's young, she's cute. And my sister, I used to have people tell me, well, you're kind of like Audrey Hepburn, but she's like Marilyn Monroe. So in my eyes, my sister was way cuter than I was. So I, of course, wanted to protect her from this guy.
Right.
And so the few times I tried saying no, or I tried asking even a question around exactly what you're talking about, hey, I'm in conflict here, then I started getting hit. And he was good about only hitting me in places that would be covered by the clothing I had to wear.
Right.
So nobody else knew how bad it was getting.
Right.
And it just kept getting worse. I tried to commit suicide a couple times to try to get out of it. I was afraid I was going to go to hell But that was better than living in the hell that I was living in, and there's no reason a junior high student should be trying to commit suicide, and I just got to this point where I didn't want to live, but I really didn't want to die either. And I felt like I was just a worthless pile of shit.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know what way to turn because anybody I tried talking to didn't believe me. They told me I was lying. They told me, oh, we know your family. We know these people. That would never be happening.
Right.
And
he's a youth leader, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So as things are progressing, my dad moved back to the area. And I had only had a couple encounters with my dad throughout my childhood. One of them was like Jerry Springer. Literally, he moved back to the area with his girlfriend that he had 3 kids with. They lived with us and my grandparents. So they shared our upstairs. It was like an A-frame house. And upstairs, my sister, my mom, and I would normally sleep as long as nobody else was borrowing our beds for the night. Well, they moved upstairs and took the beds. So my dad and his girlfriend and my mom, my sister and I, and their 3 kids were all sleeping up there. You know how awkward that is? Like your
gosh.
mom who's still in love with your dad, even though they've been divorced for years.
He's up there with his girlfriend.
Right.
Yeah, that's
sleeping
awkward.
in the same bed, like whatever. And I would sneak and watch Jerry Springer like throughout my childhood because it made me feel normal.
Yeah. Yep.
And so they're sleeping up there. Well, then he tells my grandma and my mom that he wants to marry this girl. So my mom and my grandma plan the wedding. They get married in our backyard.
Wow.
And I have to watch the kids while they're on their honeymoon. We go to drop the kids off, and I walk in on him and my new stepmom getting it on.
Mm-hmm.
And he looks up. My mom had just walked in behind me, and he waves at my mom.
Oh, jeez.
I'm like, can anybody yell Jerry?
Right.
Like, I mean, this is just insane. You can't make this stuff up.
And your mom must have been like just wrecked.
I think she was. I remember her crying later that night. But in the moment, she just waved back and was like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
it's just weird.
Conflict between what she displays to everyone else and what she's feeling inside.
Exactly. And I was kind of that confidant to my mom. She talked to me about things no mother should ever talk to a child about. And so when she did have those meltdowns, I was the one concerned about her mental health, concerned about, is she going to make it through this? All of those types of things. So he, again,
It's a lot of weight
yes,
for you to carry. So you're trying to deal with your conflict for yourself, heaven versus hell based on all these decisions you were forced to make.
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to protect your sister. You're trying to protect your mother.
Yep.
So it's all falling on your shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
And now dad's back.
Yeah, he's back. And so, like I said, I had some weird experiences with him as a young kid. But at 16, he moves back to the area, and I'm excited.
Sure.
My daddy's back.
Right.
Like, daddy's going to protect me.
Yeah.
That was not the case. And, I always just say, like, the story's bad up till this point. This is where it gets worse. So I always put a little trigger warning that this part of the story is very difficult for a lot of people to hear and difficult to live through. But there's hope on the other side of it. He moved back to the area. He calls me. He invites me to his place. And I'm excited. And I'm like, okay, Dad, I have this secret I haven't been able to tell anybody. Mm-hmm. And I brave telling my dad. And he goes, oh, bring him with you. So this guy, this youth leader that I'm explaining to my dad as my boyfriend that I'm dating, but I'm scared of him and I don't know how to stop dating him.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, well, just bring him with. So we go up to my dad's for the weekend, and he meets us out in the driveway of his trailer park, and he hugs me and he grabs my butt as I'm hugging him. But because of my experiences, I barely even noticed it. Mm-hmm. But I was like, okay, that was a little weird. But that didn't stop me from going in, right? Like, this is my dad.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, when your dad said to bring your boyfriend along, what were you expecting that to turn into?
I really thought he would maybe beat the guy up, like
Right.
tell him
Have a
not
talk to him,
right.
or something, some
Yeah.
intervention.
Yeah, do something to help me. He would at least believe. I mean, I had bruises.
Right.
I thought if nothing else, when I got there and showed him the bruises, he would be like, don't do that to my daughter,
Right.
you know? And in fact, it was the complete opposite. Within minutes of being there, he ushered me in, showed me the back bedroom. I walked into his trailer and there was a stripper pole in his living room. I didn't even know what that was. I was like, why is there a pole in your living room? And we walk back to the first bedroom on the right, and he's like, hey, this is your guys' room. He looks at who I would have called my boyfriend, and he goes, just make sure she's not too loud.
Well,
And so he rapes me right there with my dad standing in the doorway watching. And it all gets done, and they tell me, okay, well, you're the woman, go make us some food.
Oh my God.
So I go through this whole weekend going, I thought my daddy would protect me. Now what?
Right.
And right before I leave, they're like, you know, you can't tell anybody this, because if you tell somebody, they'll never let you come see me again. And you're my daughter. I love you. What every little girl wants to hear their daddy say.
Right.
so you must have felt hopeless and trapped.
100%. 100%.
What was that like?
Devastating. Like, there is no word to describe the depths of despair. Just utterly, it reinforced my belief that began as a young kid that this is what I was put on earth for. And it just felt like, again, I was scared to die, but hell can't be worse than this.
Right.
You know, and so that completely hopeless, just, I was constantly sick. Mm-hmm. Like, my whole body absorbed not only just the sexual and physical violence, but the despair.
Absolutely.
You know, why would you even want to exist anymore?
Yeah.
Right.
You know, like, if somebody could have told me I could just like push a button, you know, like in movies with like time transport or something, they just like evaporate or something. That's what I want it to do. How can I evaporate into thin air?
Right.
Because I just don't want to be.
You just wanted to end.
Yeah. And I go home, and a few days after that, there was, or maybe a week, honestly, my timeline of all of this with all the amounts of trauma is wonky. You know, my brain is never going to be able to put it in an exact timeline.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
But I go home and I'm at this girls only youth event. And I think I'm being slick and waiting till everybody goes out of the room to change into our PJs for the night. And one of my friends happened to still be in the room, and she saw the bruising. So she grabs my cell phone, dials the first number on it. I don't know why she did that. Like I said, cell phones were not wildly popular at that time, but she did. And she said, I need help, and hung up. Well, this guy, this youth leader, had a very unique truck that everybody in the church knew. And he flies into the parking lot. Well, she goes, wait a second, something's not right. Why was he the first number on her phone?
Mm-hmm.
So she had lived across the street from the church. So she runs home.
So this is a time when they were actual phone numbers and not like just showing the person's name from the contact list.
Right.
That's why she didn't know who it would be.
She had no idea who it was. Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
And honestly, I wouldn't have saved his real name in the phone anyway, because I wasn't allowed to tell anybody that I was contacting him as much as I was.
I get that.
You know, so she runs across the street to her house. She tells her parents. Same story, different verse.
Mm-hmm.
Pastors call us in, him and I both. Hey, what's going on? Well, I mean, you know from your work, James, you don't call a victim and a perpetrator into the same room and ask that question. He had hand signals that he would do to control me from across the room. And he used one of those hand signals very slyly to tell me, shut up. You don't get to say anything. So I completely shut down. And I sit there silently the whole time as they're talking to him, asking him all these questions. And he said, you know what? I'm a man. She's hot. And I made a mistake. Please forgive me type thing. They call in his parents because he's living at his parents' house. And, so parents are supposed to be involved even though he's older. And they pull in my mom. And the church comes up with this reality that my school needs to be informed. At the time, I went to a Christian school that I had to sign a contract to go there saying that I wouldn't have sex outside of marriage. So I had signed that contract. They call the school, get a meeting with the school and say, hey, she's had sex outside of marriage. I not only get kicked out of school in my 10th grade year, or end of 10th grade year, one of the teachers comes and puts me in a chokehold up against the wall and yells at me because I let her daughter down. Her daughter looked up to me, and how dare I do what I did?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So all of this fully reinforcing that this is all your fault, and that you were the bad guy here, right?
Absolutely.
And you already believe that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm just trying to understand what your frame of mind was at each of these steps. So
Yeah.
I hope that's okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
I just had no idea that this wasn't even my fault. The only thing that kept me somewhat sane throughout my childhood is I would go play in the woods and hide from my family. I had this little fort that I would hide. And when I was at the fort one day, Jesus showed up and he would play with me in the woods. And I remember telling someone that one time and they told me, don't ever say that again. That can't happen. You're a liar and you're crazy. Like, this is a mental illness thing. Even though they didn't believe in mental illness, like they were trying to shut me up basically.
Yeah.
And I went back to the woods the next day and Jesus was still there. And like we would play like cops and robbers and like I would run around and he would chase me and I would chase him. And like I got to be a kid. I didn't have to deal with all the adult problems.
Right.
He would hold me in his lap and sing songs to me. And yet even that was confusing because the religiosity I was under said that couldn't happen. But deep down in my heart, I knew that was the real Jesus, not what I was being taught. But my actual brain couldn't put the pieces together. I couldn't figure it out.
So it became an anchor for you that you held on to for all this time. And it was still in conflict with everything else. But you at least had that one, that one anchor point that you can go back to.
Right. So a lot of people will ask me about like where I am spiritually now. And I do fully believe that if he had not met me as a little girl in the woods, I would hate him. I would want nothing to do with him. But because of that anchor point, it made me recognize, wait a second, maybe Jesus is different than what this cult has been telling me for years. So not only did I get kicked out of my Christian school, I get kicked out of church. I had to stand up in front of my whole church, confess my sin. He also stood there, but they welcomed him back in and they told me to leave and not come back.
Oh my God.
Because I was not repentant enough.
But there was no responsibility placed on him.
No. I mean, even from a legal standpoint, when we look at 16 and 28, there's a problem there.
Yeah.
Right? It was never reported to law enforcement. It was nobody said anything. That was just the culture of, well, of course he's going to go after a younger girl because, he's betrothed to a 12-year-old. Right? So the week after I got kicked out of church, I find out I'm pregnant. And I told my mom, she took me to the doctors. They called him, and he came and acted like the perfect gentleman sitting in the doctor's office with me.
Of course you did.
As soon as it was over, he asked, hey, can I take her out? And we need to talk.
He asked your mom that.
Uh-huh. And my mom gave permission, and he beat the ever-living shit out of me until I lost the baby.
Oh my God.
And it, again, like I was devastated that first time when my dad was watching me be raped and didn't do anything. The devastation of having the life this child beat out of you, as someone who didn't believe in abortion, who was taught her whole life that if anything like that happened, you're evil. Like, not only do you believe something evil, you encompass Satan himself, is what I was starting to feel. I'm not just a bad, unworthy person. I am the devil himself. Like, that felt so incredibly deep within me. And I didn't know what to do.
How did you hold yourself together through that?
I didn't. I went home and I found Advil and ibuprofen and Tylenol, and I took as many bottles as I could find. And I tried really, really hard to commit suicide. My mom, I even wrote a suicide note, and my mom found the note before she found me. She took me to the hospital. Of course, they pumped my stomach and did all the things and put me in the hospital on a suicide hold. However, she called this guy to come talk to me as they're taking me to the hospital. And he tells me, you can't let the nurses see the bruising, so fight them. Well, you guys know as well as I do, when you fight the psych nurses, they drug you, and it is not a pretty thing, And so I really wonder how many drugs I still had in my system by the time I left the hospital. Because I know for a fact he picked me up from the hospital. I have no idea why I was released to anybody but my mother.
Right.
But he picked me up and took me in my car directly to my dad's house.
Wow.
And I was told I'm going to live with my dad now. I get out of the car. My dad walks me in with this guy, and they tell me that from now on, I'm going to live there. It is my job to do anything any of the men ask. If I receive any money, it is not mine, it is theirs. They take me to the back bedroom, and my dad and him together rape me brutally. And once they were finally done, they told me to go take a shower to get rid of all the blood, and that I needed to make them some food and get ready because they were going to go get a guy. And I had no idea what that meant.
Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss the next episode of Unbroken from the Ashes.
Was that if I serviced enough men, let's be real, if I was raped by enough men that night, and my dad was happy with me, that meant...
How did you get unbroken?